Hi, George.
Hi, David.
How are you?
Glad to be in conversation with you.
Me too, as well. I'm delighted that the first conversation in this series on love-driven politics is with you, the great George Lipsitz. Just a brief setup for the folks watching. George is professor of Black Studies and Sociology at University of California, Santa Barbara. A legendary figure not only in the history of the Black freedom movement and race and politics and culture in the U.S., but someone I consider to be the exemplary scholar activist. Right. So, George, welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
So, George, as you know, this series is a series of conversations around this frame of love-driven politics that you and I not just have generated, but have been talking about for a couple of years now. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why the category of love-driven politics has become meaningful for you, and also, how you would explain the category to other folks.
I think it's counterintuitive to be talking about love in a time like this.
Mm.
We live in a society that's suffused with hate, hurt, and fear that seemingly can't lock up enough people, can't deport enough people,
Mm.
can't humiliate enough people to satisfy what we sometimes call the sadism in search of a story at the heart of American public life. And under those conditions, it's understandable that people are angry and people who have been hurt want to hurt. People who have been humiliated, who have been oppressed, can be made to feel that they are unlovable and not worthy of love. And yet, the whole history of freedom loving people all around the world has been one of responding to the naders of political evil with a love driven politics of it's not enough to know what you're against, you have to know what you're for.
Mm.
It's not enough to strike back against a brutal and oppressive system. You have to plant the seed of a new way of being, of new ways of knowing, new social relations. And I think that what I see emerging everywhere are people who are determined to find something left to love in themselves and others, not as a retreat from the meanness and mendacity of this society, but rather as a way of realizing that nobody will do for us what we fail to do for ourselves. If
Mm.
we want the world to be better, we have to make it better. And we know we're not yet the people capable of doing that. We've been socialized and trained and educated in a society whose central premise is often compelling people to live with evil and then
Mm.
lying away its existence. And so, what is the chance of ethics? What is the chance of love in that kind of society? It's certainly not going to come from the main institutions and from the gatekeepers of power. So it has to come from the grassroots. It has to
Mm.
come from the bottom up. And as you and I have talked many times, we see a solidarity of working people.
Mm-hmm.
We see people locked up in maximum security prisons in the state of California finding a way to cooperate with each other and stage a strike against the inhuman conditions that they're facing. We saw young people in the streets of Ferguson, the streets of Baltimore, streets of cities throughout this country, expressing what you in Cornell West call love out loud, asserting that their lives matter, that they're worthy of love, and that their ways of working together can not only be a rejection and a refusal of an unlivable destiny, but the creation of a more humane and more just world.
Mm.
So we're at an amazing moment for these things, and I think we're facing challenges that we may not yet be ready for.
Yeah.
The things that will transpire in this society over the next few years require from us degrees of clarity, courage, and conviction that are in very short supply.
Mm.
And so we have to generate them among each other through deliberative talk, face-to-face decision making, through the arts, through religion, through philosophy, through learning, through all the ways in which people insist on being knowing and creative subjects in a society that values property more than people.
George, that is so beautiful and powerful and compelling. Um, I just want to pick up a few notes, as for the conversation itself. And I was thinking about the way you began about addressing the anger and the venom in the culture. What we've called cynicism and resentment, right? I was thinking about this yesterday. Yesterday, I was teaching Baldwin's "The Fire Next Time" in the letter to his nephew, of course, right? And he begins with that loving, tender address to his nephew. He says, "You are like your grandfather and your father, my brother, and I see in you the anger that they have. That you've inherited this." And he said, "People see you and they think you're truculent, but I know that you have a tender heart." Right? And it's an extraordinary statement on Baldwin's part. He says, inside you is a person that is worthy to be loved. You don't believe it yet because why? The culture, white supremacist culture, has told you that you are not worthy of love. And you said this a couple of times in your setup, which I think is really important. And this question, like, how do you convert a culture that has been obsessed with self-interest on the one hand and the accruing of power on the other hand? How do you convince that culture that they should choose otherwise? Because that's one of the things that Baldwin is asking his nephew. He says, the evidence is contrary. Right? It's like, there's no good reason for you to choose love. And there's no good reason. And yet, you have to love those who have hated you. You have to love those who have demeaned us, that have dehumanized us for generation after generation after generation. How do we convince folks of that? That you have to one should choose love as opposed to choosing, the conventions again of hatred, of self-loathing, of power.
Yeah, well, initially you get rejection and
Yeah,
anger
that's
and
right. That's right.
frustration.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like you're asking people to unilaterally disarm in the middle of a brutal war.
Right.
And yet, what Baldwin does in that essay is so remarkable. And here's an essay, a half a century, written more than a half a century
That's
ago.
right.
And it's as if it's been sitting on the shelf waiting for us. It's
That's
not
right.
that we didn't read it, it's not that we didn't
That's right.
teach it, but I don't think we ever knew how profound it was until this conjuncture, this historical
Yeah.
moment, where it's internal contradictions, its insistence on thinking of two diametrically opposed ideas at once. And the first is to concede that there is a logic to anger, to truculence, to resentment, to resistance. It shows life, It shows that people are, people who are broke may not be broken, that people are not only willing to knuckle under. So there's kind of a good instinct in this aggressive self-assertion that people have. But ultimately, it's the currency of the realm. It's the lingua franca of this society. It's structured in dominance. It's like trying to fight this society in a way that only makes it stronger, that only confirms its core assumptions. That and of course, we all suffer from this to some degree. And this is what Baldwin says in that essay, that sometimes you wonder if there's any place at all for you in this society.
That's right.
Because in some ways, the only way to be heard, the only way to be legible, is to speak in its terms that are inhuman, terms that are immoral, terms that are, in a word that Baldwin, as a serious person who left the church in order to preach the gospel, had the courage and the intelligence to say are simply evil. Part of the Black prophetic tradition has been that you have to name things that are evil. You can't paper them over. And so I see something good, some generative seed that can be used. It looks like we're having trouble connecting.
Oh, no. Yep.
Still there, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Right.
So in this resistance to oppression, this desire to fight back. There's something healthy.
Mm,
But, there's a Hungarian proverb that says if you stare too long at the devil, you start to look like the devil.
right.
If you think too much about the power hierarchies of this world, if you think too much about its emphasis on violence, its emphasis on humiliating enemies, its emphasis on being seen, being visible, being admired, branding yourself as a product that other people desire, all of these things, even when they're used for arguments on our side,
Yep.
affectively and spiritually, they belong to the other side.
That's right.
And we actually unwittingly make stronger the things that we're seeking to fight against. And so, Ella Baker, the great organizer of the Black Freedom Movement, the chapter secretary of SNCC, then in many ways the founder of the chapter secretary of the NAACP,
Mm-hmm.
and in many ways the founder of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, said, I don't think you're really against this society if all your criticisms of it are exactly in the terms that this society uses. And so we have to find something different. And we don't just have to make it up out of whole cloth. We don't just have to invent it out of fantasy. What Baldwin also says is that there are rich traditions and genealogies,
That's right.
currents of struggle
That's right.
that can be easily tapped. They're the reason why we're here. So many of us are living the lives we live only because of the suffering, sacrifice, and struggle of ancestors who face far worse
That's right.
conditions and circumstances than we face. And so in that essay, Baldwin encourages us to figure out how have people survived and to learn from them.
But notice the point, you mentioned earlier about everyday folks and the importance of everyday folks for love-driven politics. Remember this note that Baldwin says to his nephew, I need you to remember that I love you.
Yeah.
Right? And I mentioned that why? Because it's a precondition for the task that he's setting his nephew out for. He says, you have to love these white folks that have oppressed us, for
Yeah.
all this time.
Yeah, and not for them.
Not for them,
you.
exactly. Well, but it's an interesting, it's a morally
Yeah.
complex situation, right? He says, you need to know that I love you, right? That's going to fortify you, and that you need to know that you are loved, and therefore you can love folks that you can love in a loveless world.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and the key part of that essay to me is always when he thinks back 14 years earlier to the day when his nephew, who carries his name,
That's right.
was born. And he says, we wondered if it was right to bring a
That's
black
right.
child into this world.
That's
We
right.
wondered what right we had to subject you.
We were worried. We were trembling. He says, right?
Yeah. He says, we were trembling then.
Yeah.
We have not stopped trembling yet.
That's right.
If we had not loved each other,
That's right.
none of us would have survived.
That's right.
And you must love because you've been loved.
That's right.
And so passing on this faith, the Gnostic Gospels have a line that says, you're the reason for your ancestors' existence.
Mm.
There's a way in which the hope that a new world was possible is what motivated people to not give in to despair, to not give in to nihilism,
Right.
to not give in to simply seeking a separate peace, but in fact, for themselves, for others, for future generations, trying to create the possibilities that the world might be imbued with the possibility of making right things come to pass. That's as grandiose as the hope can be.
That's right.
And yet, it's a victory in itself. It's not simply a down payment on some future purchase. It's not simply the start of a telos that has to lead to some glorious transformation in society. It also means the here and now becomes more important. The smallness of our lives become imbued with a big purpose.
That's right.
And this is a victory in itself, even if the enemy continues to prosper.
And that idea that it's not just that you would love one's hopes into being, but you would love one's people into being, and you would love one's enemies, as it were.
Yeah.
Into a being that they do not yet know. So, and Baldwin says you love our people into being. You love yourselves into being, and you love your enemies into being, even though they don't know to be loved, right? And remember, he calls white folks, he refers to them as innocents, right?
Yeah.
That they possess a sense that they are innocent of any kind of responsibility, any kind of innocent of any kind of culpability or complicity in the hatred and racism of the culture. I must say that that really hit me hard again. When I was teaching that yesterday, and thinking about this moment as you describe it, right? Because I think there's a prevalent sense of a kind of victimization of in our politics,
Yeah.
and in not a loving politics, but it's like a sense of deprivation, a sense of of a kind of
Yeah.
profound woundedness. Right? Remember, just use this language of woundedness, right? And that is an opportunity for compassion, but it's not a ready or necessarily an obvious option for folks, right?
Yeah.
And so again, that moment of like, how do you convince folks to choose the compassion, choose empathy, choose generosity, even, right, as opposed to, again, anger, frustration, truculence, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I think C.L.R. James had a line in another context where he's talking about terrible repression, brutality, hatred in the world. And he says, only, um, only such brutality could suppress such democracy.
Hmm.
That in some ways, the threat of democratic, egalitarian social relations, the threat of a love-driven politics
Mm-hmm.
is so great that not only governments and corporations and mass-mediated forms of communication mobilize to suppress it,
Right.
even individuals who do not benefit from this system
Right.
are frightened by the disturbance.
That's
Now,
right.
some of that fright is manufactured, some of that fright is indecent
Mm.
because there's always been at the heart of white supremacy a sense of being besieged, a
That's right.
sense of what is now called reverse racism.
Mm-hmm.
That uh, David Walker in the 1820s said that whites know they're guilty of such awful crimes against blacks that they worry that the same thing will be done to them that they did
Right.
to others. And so they will hysterically demonize and demean black people in order to avoid that outcome. And some of the fear and anger, the hatred of immigrants, the
Mm-hmm.
religious bigotry against Muslims, the organized campaigns against people who are judged to have non-normative sexual identities. Part of this comes from what Luke Harris calls the fear of diminished overrepresentation.
Right.
That people who are used to imagining that they're at the center, imagining that their white skin creates for them a floor below which they cannot fall, used to believing that their interests will come first, become horrified when they have to address other men and women as equals, as
Mm-hmm.
co-creators of a shared destiny. It's
Yeah.
frightening, to them because it takes away the one reparation, the one compensation that they've been given
Right.
for all that they suffer and for all that they knuckle under to. But you remember, Baldwin also says, you have to love them because this is their only hope.
That's right.
They'll
That's
get
right.
worse and worse
That's right.
if you don't make them better.
That's
And
right.
he says, it's not fair.
That's
It's
right.
not right. You
That's right.
shouldn't have to
That's
do
right.
this. But we're linked together.
Yep.
And therefore, at the very least, you want to keep open the possibility that they won't uh, lower themselves to do their worst, and always keep open the possibility, at least hypothetically, that they can do their best. And
Yeah.
in the practice of nonviolence, you always say the best way to deal with an enemy is to make them your friend. The best way to fight against oppression is to make the oppressor a witting or unwitting accomplice in your own liberation.
Yeah.
So what other people do and think does matter. But I also think that it doesn't require persuading the pain inflictors of this world to change their behavior by itself. That we need to create social relations, social activities that people can see are better than
Good.
what exists in the society.
Good.
they will want to be part of, that we can invite them in to something that could be very exciting and exhilarating and gratifying precisely because we're able to at least temporarily suspend the power hierarchies and values of a society that really sorely needs a revolution in values more
Right.
than anything else.
Yeah, and that note, right? Even when one models or we model different behavior, we model different forms of social life, different models of politics, or just different models of ways of being in the world where it is about care, right? It is about, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about the kind of tightness of the economy, right? The tightness of the economy, political economy, the tightness of the kind of moral and emotional economy of folks. To model this behavior where you readily make space for others,
Yeah.
right? And a certain kind of graciousness about that, right? That we're going to make space for others.
This is no small matter of etiquette. This is a
Yeah,
matter of justice. This is a matter of reconfiguring
that's right.
the social world. In his great sermon, The Drum Major Instinct,
That's right.
given in Atlanta, February 4th, 1968, 2 months to the day before Dr. King is killed, he goes through all of the reasons that we become vain in the society, all the reasons why we struggle for attention, all the reasons why we imagine we can only put ourselves ahead by pushing somebody else lower. And instead of condemning all that, he says, inside that, there's a germ of something good. It's the desire to have meaning. It's the desire to make a difference in the world. It's the desire to do something important, something significant, something great. But he says if we all do it in a competitive rather than a contributive way, then we can only become great by suppressing everybody else. And we reach a kind of paralysis
That's right.
because everybody becomes everybody else's enemy. So he sees this through the 35th verse of the 10th chapter of the book of Mark. He talks about things that Jesus is saying to James and John. And what he says is, you want to be great? Fine.
Right.
You want to be significant? Fine. But you can't do it on Facebook. You
Yeah.
can't do it with an award from a professional
Yeah, yeah.
organization. You can't do it by excluding the men and women who pick the crops that
That's right.
creates the food that you eat. That's not the way to do it. He says you want to be first in love, be
That's right.
first in
That's
generosity,
right.
be first in moral excellence. You want to be important? There's important work to be done. Visiting those who are in prison, feeding the hungry, clothing those who are naked, housing the homeless. This is important work that can be done. And if
Absolutely.
you do it this way, we can all win. We
Yeah.
can all be important because we all have a job to do. And I think this goes back to what Baldwin is saying to his nephew. He doesn't just want his nephew to survive. He doesn't just want him to somehow create a personal psychological adjustment
That's right.
to this society. He's actually calling for him to be severely maladjusted
That's right.
and not giving in to
That's
the
right.
anger and the competitiveness, but seeing something else as possible because his ancestors have already done it. And
That's
that's
right.
the reason why he's here.
Yeah, and that locution that you take from King, to be maladjusted to injustice,
Yeah.
right? And that note from the Drum Major Instinct where King says to lead through love is a different form of leading,
Yeah.
right? And
That
and
picture is out in front of the parade.
that's right.
Everybody looks at them.
That's right.
He
That's
says
right.
that's the instinct. You
That's
have
right.
to be in front of other people. He says, but that will always fail. That will always lead to terror. He says it leads to war. It
Mm-hmm.
leads to brutality. It leads to a materialism, which is a kind of idolatry in which the only things that count are things and that people don't count at all. And he says it goes in the worst direction. But typical of King, he says, you have to take these bad things and make them good. You have to turn poison into medicine. You have to
Mm-hmm.
see how humiliation can become honor. And you have to, as you and I have often said, he says you have to have a tough mind
That's
and a
right.
tender heart.
That's right.
And our society, of course, laughs at a tender heart, and it also these days laughs at a tough mind.
That's
It doesn't want either one. It
That's
just
right.
wants,
That's right.
a kind of us to be little dictators getting our way. And this will not work.
But I think the derision and the laughter at the tender-hearted is born out of a certain anxiety, right? I don't want to appear vulnerable, nor do I want to confess my vulnerability. And it's
I
born
think
out of a
it's,
profound need, right? We all need that tender heart.
yeah, it's very frightening to open
That's
that
right.
door.
That's right.
And also, we have to be fair that so many people in religious groups, in mobilizations for social justice, have used that language
Mm,
of compassion and tenderheartedness cynically and manipulatively.
that's right.
And they've promoted an understanding of, they've confused pity and sympathy with solidarity. They encourage people to cultivate their own feelings and aestheticize their alienation from this society by thinking about tenderness rather than the tenderness of social justice, the
Right.
tenderness of love for other humans. And so, if people are suspicious and they don't want to be fooled again, we have to understand that there's, again, a very good reason for that. And of course, we ourselves have mixed motives and mixed
Absolutely.
desires in trying to
Absolutely.
advance this. But I've always felt that in the long run, the people will always know who tried to be on their side.
Mm,
We may not succeed, we may not be the ones capable of doing that.
that's right.
And you may not get rewarded or win victories. But the important thing is that the people have to know that you tried.
Well, I think the victories won are not recognized as conventional victories,
Yeah.
right? That you and I have spoken a lot about the hard work of patience, right? And so that and the notion that you have written so beautifully about accompaniment, right? So that to accompany folks, to sit with them, to dwell with them,
Yeah.
to say that your life is worthy of my time, right?
Yeah.
In itself, it requires all sorts of disciplines, right? Because you have to set aside your own interests. You have to set aside the desire to say, well, me first, right?
Yeah.
Me first. And, again, I think, and I'm very moved by what you say about showing and living otherwise, right? Loving otherwise. And that you have to have the faith that this will generate a different kind of politics and this will generate a different kind of way.
Yeah. Including showing the weaknesses, the contradictions,
That's
the
right.
shortcomings that we have as we attempt to do this. It's not something that can happen easily. You talked about accompaniment and dwelling,
Yeah.
and there's an engineering term to dwell, which means to pause at a certain moment.
Nice.
It's a moment where things stop.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment,
Mm-hmm.
something new always becomes possible.
Mm,
So, Trisha Rose, in writing about hip hop, says the breakbeat is important in a hip hop song because the instruments lay out and some dancer gets up and does something amazing.
that's right.
The
That's right.
ensemble stops and one soloist comes forward and creates possibilities that hadn't been thought of. It's almost as if time is suspended, stands still, and in that moment, something new can be created.
That's right.
And if you're always rushing to get somewhere, if you're always pursuing, a path whose destination you don't dwell, you don't accompany, you
Yeah.
don't have patience for it. You want people to get on board,
Yeah.
and yet in that dwelling, in that accompaniment, in those moments at the crossroads where the right thing can look like the wrong thing and the wrong thing
That's right.
can look like the right thing, that's the seed of a new society. That's the seed of new ways of being and new ways of knowing.
Mm.
But of course, you have to recognize them when they're here, and you have to cultivate your capacity to respond to them.
So, George, I have to ask, because I know you as such a profoundly generous soul in your politics, in your intellectual work. So I have to assume, given that and what we've been talking about, that you have experienced you've had profound experience of love itself and generosity. Might you talk about some of the, maybe just the ones that come to mind to you?
Yeah. Well, I think that our language is so impoverished even in talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
And so what reads as generosity in this society entails a kind of gift from a position of superiority to a position of inferiority.
Mm-hmm.
That someone is generous because they give something away to something who needs it.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. King talks about this when he talks about the Good Samaritan, and he says that, of course, the traditions that exist in the West do teach us to have this kind of openness. He says, but it's not enough to flip a coin in the cup of a beggar. We have to address the conditions that make begging possible to begin with.
That's right.
And so the love that Baldwin is talking about, I think, is more solidarity than it is generosity. It's more intersubjectivity than it is charity. It's more co-creation than it is love in the way that,
Right.
love is understood in this society as a personal gift from one person, to another. And I think that one of the things that has been such a gift to me in my life is to be around people, most of them coming from what my friend Cedric Robinson calls the Black radical tradition, for whom knowledge is collective, for whom love is collective, for whom all the things that we are made up of our dialogue and our negotiations and even our frustrations with other people. You see, this is exactly what Black music is all about. It's not about playing things in advance. It's creating a social situation in which something new comes to the fore. So my own experience, there are, of course, people who stand out. The St. Louis activist Ivory Perry, the musician Johnny Otis, the longshoreman Stan Weir, people who carved away eccentric spaces in areas of society not set up for liberation, not set up for emancipation, and conveyed to me through instruction, through apprenticeship, through imitation, through appreciation, ways of acting, that I try to emulate. But even to talk about them, they didn't want to be known as singular founts of generosity. They wanted to be the conveyors of a collective knowledge, a collective morality, a collective experience in which everybody has a part to play. Nobody can do everything. Everybody can do something. We all have a responsibility to help each other out. And so, again, you think of anybody has flaws, has contradictions, has shortcomings. And often by calling each other generous, we want to paper those over. We want to make somebody else a symbol that frees us from the contradictions of our own life.
Right.
But every time we make them greater, we make ourselves lesser.
Yeah.
And we're actually missing the point of what they tried to teach us, was that generosity is not a set of individual acts by individual people. It's an ethic that is shared by people and that has to become in some ways so invisible we don't even recognize it as generosity.
Right.
It becomes the way we operate. It's only generosity by the norms and evaluation systems of a society that is deeply ungenerous.
Well, and yeah, again, so beautifully stated that, pick up a couple of notes to add to that, right? Because when you say, like we are faulty, we are imperfect, we are necessarily imperfect as human, right? And that to love and to receive, often we're often too ready to feel disappointed. That leads to a certain kind of disaffection, right? And that disappointment, it feels to me as often born out of a certain kind of immaturity about what human relationships are about. It's like, well, why didn't you do better? Why didn't you show up perfectly? Or as you say, to like fill the gaps and voids that you see in me, right? And it is this very complex awareness. Like, how do we become aware, attuned, sensitive to not just the needs of those we're with and in solidarity with, to use the language you said earlier, but also who we are at that moment.
Yeah.
In that solidarity, right? So that when we embrace arms, when we put our arms around each other, right, we have our own pains and struggles, as well as those that we're accompanying. And so that quality, so what else is missing in the culture? One of the things that's missing in the culture is a kind of sense of the humility that there's other folks who are suffering as well.
Yeah, right? Well, and as you well know and have spoken about and written about eloquently time and time again, sometimes these things are easier to solve intellectually than
That's right.
affectively.
That's right.
It's,
That's right.
you know you shouldn't be disappointed.
That's right.
You know you shouldn't feel the stings of betrayal.
That's right.
You know you shouldn't feel um, depressed by other people's frailties. And yet these things hurt deeply.
Hmm.
This is part of what I think Baldwin
Yeah.
is saying, as well. My friend Ivory Perry used to say that being for justice in this society is like being in love with someone who's not in love with you.
Mm.
You can see how it would work out.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
cajoling them,
Yeah.
you're inviting them in,
Yeah.
and it just doesn't happen. But if you really love them, you keep going.
That's
You
right.
keep trying to bring these things about. But of course, you carry your scars and injuries with
That's
you,
right.
and
That's right.
you then make yourself capable of hurting other people, whether that's your intention or not. And
Yeah.
if you want to be forgiven, you have to forgive.
That's right.
But it is very, very hard to do
That's right.
because the you expect your enemy to not be credible, to not be moral.
Right.
You don't expect those you love to fall short in those ways. It
And
hurts.
you don't expect yourself. You don't want to admit yourself, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I think about Audin's line of, that crooked love that comes out of my crooked heart, right?
yeah, nice.
Right.
Well, there's a line in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon where Empire State and Railroad Tommy, two elderly black men, are in a barber shop, and two young guys, guitar and the milkman, come in. And the youngsters, the teenagers, complain that the guy down the street wouldn't give them a beer,
Right.
and they're disappointed. And Railroad Tommy, who has been a Pullman porter
Hmm.
and has seen wealth that he doesn't own, who has had to cater to the needs of people who hated him and despised him, who has a life of humiliation and subordination, can't really believe that they're complaining about something like not getting a beer because so much else is awaiting them in life that's even worse.
That's right.
And he says, you didn't get a beer. Let me tell you the other things you're not going to get in life. And he starts giving a list of every luxury he's seen and not had:
Right.
burgundy, fine cigars,
Right.
steak dinners, desserts with baked Alaska, which is, a
Right.
cake
Yeah. Yeah.
with ice cream in it. And the kids are amazed at this torrent of bitterness that
Hmm.
they've unleashed. And so they try to lighten the moment. And they say, "Oh, baked Alaska, you're breaking my heart." And Railroad Tommy says, "Ah, there's something you will get: a broken heart,
That's
a
beautiful.
whole lot of folly, a whole lot of folly."
Mm.
And so, what do we do, with this? That part of us says, let's not try because we can only get hurt.
Hmm.
Let's not venture out there. Let's try to maximize our
Yeah.
short-term pleasures to avoid this. And yet, that doesn't win either,
That's right.
because there's always something more that you want. There's always a way in which people disappoint you. And so again, the only way to respond to that disappointment is to try to be less disappointing to others, to
Mm.
try to create a situation in which it'll catch on, it'll be contagious, in which you
Right.
can bring out in people their better side. Now, again, David, I have to tell you, I talk a better game about this than I live, because it is so hard to
Of
do, and
course.
there are uh, wounds and betrayals that I think we all experience that are so deep. And I don't think you can stop bad things from happening in the world. I don't think you can get justice for the bad things that have happened to you. All you can do is to try to create better things for yourself and others down the
That's
road.
right. Well, and then that I think that's right, and I think the question about the inevitable condition of brokenheartedness, right? That we must admit that we're all heartbroken for one reason or another, and that we actually have multiple heartbreaks that we carry with us. And, we can delude ourselves or to deny ourselves the seriousness of that. But then, paradoxically, it also requires a certain kind of lightheartedness, as it were, right?
Exactly.
I mean, I like that quote from Morrison that you just said about folly, right?
Yeah.
The necessity of folly, the necessity of joy, right? So imagine that politics is infused with a good bit of joy, if for no other reason, for the fact that you found somebody else to be in solidarity with.
Yeah, yeah, and who reads back to you
That's right.
the experiences that you've had in a slightly different way.
And reveals
And
possibility that way, right?
yeah, and that, these heartbreaks can be very helpful.
Mm,
They can teach you something, and again, it's not, there's a saying, it's not what happens to you, it's what happens in you.
right.
So much depends upon how you carry this burden for yourself and others. At the very least, other people are watching you, and if
Yeah.
you're petty and vindictive, they're learning to be petty and vindictive from you. Now, if you're not petty and vindictive, they may just write you off
Right.
because you're illegible to
Yeah.
them. They
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know
Right.
how you operate in the society, but there's a chance that you can make things better through your behavior, and also, it isn't always good to win. The things you want aren't always the right things for you. There's a line from Lauryn Hill that says, "The things you want can make you cry, and the
Mm,
things you need can pass you by." And so we shouldn't be so sure that our wants and desires, the things that disappoint us, would have been good for us if we had them. In some ways, those disappointments can be very helpful and valuable.
no, no, that's right. And the logic of conventional power politics is that it's instrumental, right? So that I know what's strategic, I know what success or, as you say, winning looks like, right? As opposed to being surprised.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, I do a lot of work in fair housing cases, and
Hmm.
sometimes a law firm will say to us, "We've never lost the case."
Right.
That's the last firm you want to be. Because if they've never lost the case, they've
Right.
never pushed the law in
That's
any
right.
meaningful way.
That's
They've
right.
never taken on a case who deserved justice in a difficult
Right.
situation. And it's similarly, you see these educational reform things, and they
That's right.
say 100% of the students went to college and scored well on the test. And
Right.
this is a fake.
Right.
This is
Right.
not the way things work. And it's a desire that's totally antithetical to doing meaningful work in the world.
That's right. And I thinking going back to the note about the Black freedom tradition and Black music, right? Not just the blues, but even this the sense in which it's not there are different forms of rhythm, right? And that the backbeat is as important, as being on time, right?
Yeah, and there's a million different ways to play, and
That's right.
sometimes I'm just keeping time, and that's important. It's
That's right.
important for me to stay in the pocket if
That's
you're
right.
gonna
That's
gonna
right.
solo. But there are other times where we'll switch on
That's right.
that, and there are times in which even our limits, can be very helpful.
That's right.
Django Reinhardt had his fingers burned in a fire, and so
Right.
he played single string runs instead of chords. He turned a
Right.
defect into an advantage. And so many times, this is what happens. I always laugh because Howlin' Wolf is actually not a good singer, not a good harp player, and not a good guitarist. But somehow when he does all three, it's great. It's fantastic when it comes together. That's a good lesson.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that, and I love the spirit, George, that you bring of turning crisis into opportunity, crisis into calling, a sense of calling, right? Because I think and maybe this is a note to end on, right? The ways in which we're calling people to join us in a project of love-driven politics. And George, I'm so grateful to be in solidarity with you.
Well, thank you, David. I always learn so much from our conversations and from your actions in the world. And so, you help me be who I want to be. And, I was looking for you for a long time before I found you. And so I'm glad we have these interactions.
Right back at you, my friend. I love you so much, and I'm so, as I say, profoundly humbled and grateful. Thank you so
Okay.
much, George.
Peace out. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right.
Okay. I'm going to